Hi, my name is Brett Wood. I'm a software engineer on the StarCraft II team here at Blizzard. Today we're going to be taking a look at the StarCraft II editor, which is a tool that you can use to create maps and mods for StarCraft II. This editor is the same program that we use internally to create all of our campaign missions and even the story mode in between missions. So this is a very powerful and robust tool, and we're definitely not going to be able to cover everything that the editor can do in this tutorial. And as we go through the tutorial, you'll see on the screen a ton of different buttons and options and data, and we're really just going to focus on the specific pieces that we need to create the tutorial map. The map that we're going to be making is a simple single-player mission where the player is controlling a Terran patrol squad that's exploring a canyon and encountering enemy Zerg along the way. There'll be 3 Zerg encounters. First will be a simple discovery of Zergling units on the canyon floor. The second will be an ambush by Hydralisks from on top of the canyon walls. And then finally, there'll be battle at a Zerg base at the end of the canyon. And as we're developing this map, we're also going to load it into the game periodically to test it out and review our progress. And we'll see that frequent testing of the map in game can help you iterate on the map's design. So the tutorial is broken down into 5 different parts. In part 1, we're going to begin with a general overview of the editor toolset, and then we're going to create our map and set up some basic properties for it, and then see how to load it into the game for testing. In part 2, we're going to create the map's environment, including terrain, cliffs, and textures, and also doodads to complete the look of the map. And then we'll start adding units, including the Terran units and the initial Zergling encounter. In part 3, we're going to learn about regions, endpoints, and triggers, and see how to put those all together to create the Hydralisk ambush event. In part 4, we will add the Zerg base at the end of the canyon, and also learn how to use custom data to adjust the strength and appearance of individual units. And then finally, in part 5, we'll set up the map for the Battle.net arcade, and then publish it to the service so everyone can play it and enjoy it. So let's get started. In part 1, we're going to start out with a general overview of the editor toolset, and then we're going to create the map and set up some basic properties for it, and also see how to load it into the game. So the editor is made up of multiple different windows, which we call modules. And they can be seen in the toolbar with the blue buttons, and they can also be accessed from the modules menu. First module is the terrain module, and here is where you create the map environments, including terrain, cliffs, and textures. And you can also add objects to the world, including units like marines or hatcheries, anything that the player can control in the game. And also doodads, which don't affect the gameplay and are just used to increase the visual appeal of the map. The second module is the trigger module. This represents the game's scripting system, and here you can set up scripted events or also custom gameplay rules. The next module is the data module, and this contains all of the data values used by the game. And here you can customize pretty much anything in the game. This can be as simple as changing the life total for a unit, or it could be something as complicated as creating an entirely new ability and special effects from scratch. So let's go back to the terrain module, and let's create our map. So we'll click on the new button to create a new document. And first you have to choose what type of document you're creating. There's several different options. A melee map is just a standard StarCraft II map that doesn't have any custom triggers or custom data. Training map can have custom triggers or custom data, but the gameplay in the map is still fundamentally melee. This could be maps for practicing or testing your melee combat skills, or it could also be melee games that have special events like lava rising on the low ground. Next, we have arcade maps, which show up in the Battle.net arcade, and these can be any type of custom map with no limitations. Finally, you can create mod files, which can contain custom data or triggers to be shared between multiple maps. So we'll be creating an arcade map. The next step is to choose dependencies, which defines what data is available for the map to use. You can use our standard data, or you could also use custom dependencies. This is where you would add any custom mods made by you or other players. We're going to be using Heart of the Swarm data and including the campaign data. And then finally, you configure the initial terrain for your map. We're going to leave the default size of 128, and we're going to be using the Xeris texture set. And you click OK, and your map is created. Now, when you first create a map, there's several properties that you should configure right away. The first is to give the map a name and description. That can be done in the Map Info dialog under the Map menu. So we'll set up a name for our map. This is for one player. We'll give it a description. All right, another thing you should do when you create a map is to determine how many players the map is for. And you can set that up in the Player Properties dialog, also in the Map menu. And by default, a map will have one player, which is user-controlled. Since this is a single-player map, we're just going to add one computer enemy player. So we'll change the controller for player 2 to computer. That's all we need to do in here. And for custom maps, another important step is to remove the melee trigger. So we'll jump over to the triggers module. And you can see that maps by default have a trigger called melee initialization, which sets up all of the melee gameplay for the map, including starting resources, starting units, computer AI. So we don't want any of that for our map, so we're going to go ahead and choose clear to get rid of it. And we'll jump back to the terrain module. And now our map is more or less set up, so this is a good place to save the map. I'll just save it to the desktop here. And now that our map is set up, we can see how to load it in the game to test it out. There's a function called test document, and if you click that, it'll just launch StarCraft 2 and load your map right into it. So here's our map. There's obviously not much to see yet since we haven't added anything. When we want to go back to the editor, we can just hit Alt-Tab. That'll minimize the game, and you can actually leave the game running while you're working on your map in the editor. That'll make it faster to load it the next time you want to test it. So that's the end of part 1. In part 2, we're going to start creating the map environment by adding some terrain, cliffs, and textures, and we're also going to add the initial units so we have a playable map. All right, so now we're going to be working in the terrain module, and we're going to first go over some of the basics of what the terrain module can do, and then we're going to add terrain cliffs and textures to our map, as well as some doodads to make it a little more visually appealing. And then we'll create some initial units for the Terran player, as well as for the first Zerg encounter. So in the terrain module, you can see on the right is the 3D world view. And to navigate that view, you use the various camera controls with the mouse. The first thing you can do is if you hold down the right mouse button and drag, you'll move the camera around. If you hold down the control key and then use the right mouse button and drag, you can rotate the camera up and down and left and right. You can use the mouse wheel to zoom out and back in. And then you can double click the middle mouse button to reset to the default camera settings. And you can also left-click on the mini-map and drag around to move the camera that way. Now, in the terrain module, there are multiple layers for working with different parts of the map data. These are seen using the orange buttons in the toolbar. It can also be accessed from the layer menu. In the terrain layer, there's several different brushes in the palette that you can use. There's the texture brush for changing the texture on the ground, like adding grass. There's a height brush for changing the 3D height field of the terrain. Then with the cliff brush, you can raise cliff levels, and you can also add ramps to get up to the cliff levels. There are terrain objects, which are special types of doodads that actually replace parts of the terrain. I'll go ahead and place artifact dig site, and you can see that it just replaced a big chunk of the terrain with a giant hole. Then there's the water brush, where you can put planes of water down, and you would typically want to do those along cliff edges, so it looks nice. Then there's a few more advanced brushes for placing roads and lighting effects and Zerg creep that we won't go over here. So let's get started on our terrain for our map. We'll start with the cliff brush, and start creating the canyon. So I'm going to start with the raised cliff brush, start creating some cliff walls here. And the raised cliff brush, wherever you click, it'll raise the cliff up another level. So if I click again, it's going to raise it up a second level. But we actually don't want 2 cliff levels for our map. So if you ever do something you don't like, you can always undo it with the undo command or Control-Z. And another way to get rid of cliffs, you can always switch to the lower cliff brush and then click on the cliffs to lower them back down. If you hold down Shift while you're applying the cliff brush, it'll do the opposite of what the brush normally does. So I have the raised cliff brush active right now. If I hold down Shift, it'll actually lower the cliffs. So you can quickly switch between raising and lowering. So let's just fill out our canyon here. All right, so now we've got a basic canyon shape laid out. We can switch over to the texture brush. When using the texture brush, one very useful tool is under the Tools menu. There's a brush submenu, and there's an option at the bottom called Same Cliff Level Only. And if you turn that on, it means any cliff operations that you apply will only happen on the cliff level that you clicked. And even if you drag down to another cliff level, it won't apply it there. So it's a good way to keep textures on a single cliff level. So let's go over some of the texture operations. You can add textures, and then you can remove textures. Uniform texture means it'll have the same blending value across everywhere that the brush operates. Then you can replace one texture with another. The smudge and blur brushes are ways of smoothing out edges between existing textures. And then finally, the fill texture operation will fill an entire cliff level with a single texture. And we're going to go ahead and use that to put grass on our upper cliff levels. Then we'll switch back to the Add Texture brush and put some algae up here on the upper cliff levels. And then we can put some pebbles down here on the lower cliff level too. And you can see, even if I drag up here, because of that option, it's not putting pebbles on the upper cliff level. All right, we've got a good start on the textures. We can switch over to the doodad layer and put in some doodads. I'm going to put some brambles along the cliff edges here. And then maybe a few bones just to make it a little more foreboding. All right, now we've got a basic environment set up. We can put in some units. So we'll switch over to the units layer. And we'll start off by putting in a Terran outpost and a Terran patrol squad. So for player 1, switch over to Terran units here. Start off with structures. We can put in a command center and a barracks and a bunker here. Then we can change over to units and give the player some Marines and some Marauders. All right, and now we can put some Zerglings in the canyon for the first Zerg encounter. So we'll switch to player 2. And we'll put some Zerglings in here. All right, so we've got a playable map now. It's a good time to save it, and then we can load it in the game and test it out.
By the numbers, boys. Go, go, go! Oh, yeah!
All right, so we've got a good start on our map now. In part 3, we're going to learn about regions and points and triggers and set up the Hydralisk ambush event. So in this next part, we're going to start working with the trigger module and learn about regions and points and set up the Hydralisk ambush event. All right, since the last part, I've tweaked the map and modified it a little bit to make it a little more playable. I've expanded the canyon to give us a little more room to work. All right, so now we're going to add the ambush, which is going to occur in the corner of the canyon here. And the first thing we need to do is add a region where the ambush will occur. So I'm going to switch over to the regions layer, and I'm going to add a rectangle region, and I'm just going to click and drag and then let go to place the region. And our trigger is going to detect when the Terran units enter this region to fire off the ambush, so it's important that the region covers the entire canyon area so no units can sneak through. Now that we have the region down, we can also rename it so it's easier to find in the triggers. And if you press the space bar, you'll switch to selection mode. Then you can click to select the region and double click to bring up the properties dialog. I'm going to call this the kill zone region. And the next thing we need to do is add some points where the hydralisks are going to appear. So I'll switch over to the point layer and select normal points. First, I'm just going to place down one point and then switch to selection mode with the space bar again and double click it to rename it. I'll call this ambush 1. And to make additional points, we can just use the copy paste functionality to copy the point and then paste another one in. Also Control C and Control V. And you can see that the name automatically incremented the number at the end of it. And we're going to go ahead and put a total of 8 points in here. So now we've got the points in the region set up. It's time to create our trigger. So we'll go over to the trigger module. And the first thing we need to do is use new trigger. This will be for our ambush. I'll just call it ambush. Now let's look at the parts of a trigger. First, we have events. An event is anything that can happen in the game that will cause the trigger to run. So let's add an event for our trigger using the new event command. Here is a huge list of all the possible events you can use. And we want to use the unit label to find just the events associated with units. And the event we want is unit enters or leaves region. So we'll select that. And once the event is in place, you can see the parameters of the event down here. Right now, it's any unit enters entire map. And we want to change the region to our kill zone. So if we double click that and change to the value source, you can see our kill zone region here. And we'll select that. So now we have a trigger that's going to fire anytime a unit enters the kill zone. And the second part of triggers are conditions, which are rules that are checked when the event occurs to see if the trigger should actually run or not. So we're going to use new condition for our trigger. And most conditions are comparisons, where you're comparing one value with another value. For our case, we're going to be counting the number of units in a region. And this is actually built up from two different functions. So we're going to go to unit group and count the number of units in a unit group. And this adds a unit group parameter, which will be another function. And this will be units in region matching condition. This is how we're going to find units in the kill zone. And if we double click the region parameter, we can change that again to our kill zone region. And we want to detect only units controlled by player 1. So we can set the player value to 1. And now for our comparison, we want to see if there are a significant number of Terran units in the region. We don't want the ambush to fire as soon as the first unit enters the region. We want most of the group to be there. So we're going to see if the number of units is greater than or equal to 4. Then click OK, and we have our condition. So the condition is requiring that player 1 has at least 4 units inside the kill zone region. And the last part of triggers are actions, which define what the trigger will actually do when it runs. We're going to start with an action to create the Hydralisk units. So this is an action called create units facing point. And we want to change the type to Hydralisk. Let's switch to Zerg units here. And this unit will be owned by player 2, which is the computer player. And it'll be created at our first ambush point. So I'll select ambush 1. And we want it to be facing the center of the kill zone region. So there's a function called center of region. And we'll select the kill zone. Now, since we have 8 of them, we can use copy-paste again to just create 8 copies of this action. And then change the point for each one. So I'll do that for all 8 points here. To copy and paste, I'm just using the Control-C and Control-V hotkeys to do it a little more quickly. All right, so now we've got our 8 Hydralisks being created. And to give the event a little more flavor, I'd like to display a message to the player when the ambush occurs. So we can add another action called text message. And I just typed TX to jump right to it there since I knew what it was called. And we can display a message. It's an ambush on the screen. And then one more important action that we need is to prevent this trigger from running more than once, because right now it's going to occur every time a unit enters the kill zone. So we don't want it to be happening repeatedly as all of the turn units enter the zone. So we'll add one more action. This is in the trigger label called turn trigger on or off. And the default parameters are exactly what we want. This will turn the current trigger off, so it'll only ever run once. All right, so now we've got our ambush event all set. We can save the map and launch it in the game to test it.
By the numbers, boys. Gangway, coming through. Oh, yeah. 10-4.
All right, so as the turn units enter the corner here, it's going to trigger our event. And there's the message. There's a problem here that we can't see the Hydralisks even though they can see us. It's not very fun this way. So one thing we can do now is change the trigger to actually reveal the Hydralisks. So let's jump back over to the editor and go to the trigger module. So let's add an action to reveal the Hydralisk so we can fight back and make it a little more fun. So there's an action called reveal area. And this requires a region, but we don't want to just use the kill zone region because it's not big enough. It's not going to cover all of the Hydralisks. So if we click the choose button, we can jump back to the terrain module in the regions layer, and we can add a new region right here. I'm going to create a circle region this time and make sure it covers all of the ambush points. And then I'm going to select it in the list here. That'll switch us right back to selection mode. And then as it says down here, if you press Q, it'll jump right back to the trigger module and have our new region in the list. And we'd like to reveal this for, say, about 12 seconds, so the player has enough time to fight back for a little bit and then maybe run away. All right, so now we've tweaked our trigger. We can save the map again, test it out again.
By the numbers, boys. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Keep your shirt on, Sparky. 10-4.
All right, so this time when the ambush occurred, now we can see the Hydralisks and we can fight back a little bit. Still seems like a little too many Hydralisks for me, so I'm gonna run away.
Roger that.
Oh, now I can't see them anymore.
Can't wait.
All right, so now we've got the ambush event all set up. In the next part, we're going to finish off the map by putting in the Zerg base in the final battle, and also learn how to use custom data to tweak the unit strength and appearance. All right, in part 4, we're going to set up the final battle at the Zerg base at the end of the canyon, and we'll also create some triggers for the victory and defeat conditions of the map. And then we'll see how to use custom data in the data module to adjust the strength and appearance of individual units. So we'll start out in the terrain module again, and we'll go up here to the end of the canyon. We're going to switch over to the units layer, and we're going to put down a Zerg base. So let's put a hive in here, maybe a couple of creep tumors to expand the creep a bit. I'll switch over to units. We'll put some banelings in. Put them over here so they can roll in from the side. And then what's a final battle without a boss? Let's find Kerrigan here. She's a campaign hero. And let's put Kerrigan in. All right, so there's the base for the Terrence encounter. Since this is the final battle of the game, we need to set up some triggers that'll handle victory and defeat for the player. So we'll go over to the triggers module, and we'll create a new trigger. First one will be for victory. And we want the player to win if they can kill Kerrigan. So we'll create an event for unit dies. And for the unit, we can just select Kerrigan directly from the value source. You can see these are all the units that I've placed on the map. We're going to select Kerrigan here. And we don't need any conditions for this since there's only one Kerrigan and she can only die once. And then for the action, we want a game action called endgame for player. And this does what we want, end the game in victory for player 1. Now we need another trigger for defeat. And we want defeat to happen whenever the player doesn't have any units that are not structures. And this is something we can just check periodically. So there's an event called periodic event. And I'm going to check this every 1 second of game time. And we definitely need conditions for this one because it's going to go off every second of game time. And the condition that we want is player 1 doesn't have any units on the map that are not structures. And this condition is actually pretty similar to the one we used in the ambush trigger. So I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste the condition out of that trigger into our defeat trigger. And then we can change the parameters down here. So we don't want the kill zone region anymore. We want to change this back to entire map in the function area. And we also want to change the unit filter to exclude structures. So we'll scroll down to the structure type and double click that twice to get to excluded. So now structures are excluded. And we want to check if the count is equal to 0. So I'll change this back to equals and change value 2 to 0. So now we have a condition requiring that player 1 has 0 non-structure units anywhere on the map. And when that happens, we want to end the game in defeat for the player. So we'll use endgame for player again and change the type to defeat. So now we've got our boss battle and our victory defeat trigger set up. We can save the map and test it out in the game.
Armed and ready. I feel you. You got it. Booyah! Outstanding. Sure thing. Got it. 10-4. Gangway.
All right, as we approach the end of the canyon, you can see the creep.
Sure. Go, go, go.
There's the Zerg base, and there's the banelings and Kerrigan. We actually seem to be winning pretty easily here. And there's victory. The player actually won a little bit too easy here, so now let's go back to the editor and let's make it a little more challenging now by buffing the banelings. So we'll switch over to the data module now. And in the data module, there are many different types of data you can work with. Units is one of the most important one. And if that's not showing, you can choose data, edit game data, units, and then the units tab will pop up. And I'm going to use the search filter here to find Baneling. And in general, objects in the data editor are linked together, sometimes in very complicated ways. And the best way to visualize that is using the Object Explorer. So if you go to the View menu and turn on Show Object Explorer, this will bring up a view in the bottom left of the window. And this will show all of the other objects that are linked to what you currently have selected. So we can see everything that's linked to the Baneling. And the first thing we want to do is increase the damage that the Baneling does. And damage is normally handled by effects. So we're going to scroll down to effects here. And you can see the Baneling has quite a few different effects. There's two of them that control damage. First is the direct damage through Explode Large Direct. And when you select an object in the Explorer here, all of the data values associated with that object will show up on the right-hand side. And the very first one is the one we want, Combat Amount. It's the amount of damage dealt by the effect. And we're going to increase that from 40 to 60. And Banelings also do damage to a search area through the large search damage. And we're going to change its damage from 40 to 60 also. In addition to increasing the damage, we'd like to make the Banelings a little more visually intimidating. And visual effects for units are normally in the actor. So I'll select the Baneling actor now. And I want to increase the scale to make them bigger. And that's handled by the Art Scale field. And we're going to change this so it's 1.5 times as big as normal in all three dimensions. And once that's done, we can jump back to the train module and see that the Banelings are already bigger there. So now let's test out our stronger Banelings in the game. Save the map first.
By the numbers, boys. That's fine. Go, go, go! Aye, aye, sir. I feel ya. Sure enough. Will do. Roger that. Can't wait. Orders received. Gangway coming through. 10-4.
Wow, they took us out really fast. So it seems like Banelings might be a little bit too strong this time. We'll have to balance this map further in the future. Now we've got the gameplay for our map completed. In the final part, we're going to set it up for the Battle.net Arcade and then publish it to the service for everyone to play. So in part 5, we're going to set up the map for the Battle.net Arcade and then publish it to the Battle.net service. All of the info associated with the arcade is in the Arcade Info dialog under the Map menu. And the first thing you see in here is the icon. This is one of the most important things because it's the first thing that players will see when they find your map online. We're going to use the Browse button to pick one of the stock icons. I'll pick the Zergling icon. But when you're making your map, you can use the Import button here to import any custom image that you want. Then you can add screenshots to your map to show it off to people before they play it. In the How to Play section, you can set up some instructions so they understand the basics of playing your map before they play. We'll add some instructions here. Then you can also add screenshots associated with your How to Play instructions. You could set up a tutorial mode for your map. And then finally, you can add patch notes to explain what's changed in each of your map updates. We'll go ahead and add an initial version here. Once that's all set up, now it's time to actually publish the map. First, we'll save it, and then go to the Publish dialog under the File menu. And the first thing you need to do is log into Battle.net. And on the next screen, you'll see several different options. First of all is the revision. This affects the way that the version number of your map is going to change. Major revision means that the first number will change, and this is usually for large updates to the map that add significant new features. And a minor revision means the second number will increment, and this is usually used for bug fixes or minor balance tweaks. You can release the map as either private or public. A private release means only you are going to be able to see the map online, but then you could invite your friends to play, and you would typically want to do this for private playtesting sessions. And then if you change it to a public release, then everybody can find your map and create games using it. Finally, you have to choose whether your map is locked or unlocked. Locked map means that it will not be able to be loaded back into the editor. And you can use this to prevent people from copying your map, but it also means you won't be able to share your map with other map makers. If you unlock the map, then anybody can load it in the editor, and they would be able to learn from it or contribute to it. And then on the final panel, it makes sure that you have room on your accounts to publish your map. And then you can click OK. And this warning is just making sure you understand that you're publishing your map out to the public world. And then your map will get uploaded to Battle.net. Now we can switch over to the game and log into Battle.net and find our map. So once you're on Battle.net, you click the arcade button to get to the arcade interface. And then at the very bottom is My Published button, where you can see all of the maps that you've published yourself. And you can click on your map. You can see description, how to play instructions. There's our patch notes. And then we can go ahead and create a game. So that concludes the map making tutorial for the StarCraft 2 editor. We hope you've enjoyed it and learned a lot, and we look forward to seeing all the awesome maps that you guys are going to make and publish to the Battle.net arcade.